Today we're going to speak of relationships again, building upon the last video in which we discussed some important elements regarding the concept of self in relation to other people. And this is stimulated by a quote from Neville's lecture, "By imagining we become." And he states, "Man is only limited by weakness of attention and poverty of imagination. The great secret is a controlled imagination and a well-sustained attention, firmly and repeatedly focused on the object to be accomplished." Now, when we got into conversation about this in the last video, we spoke about the ideal self-image that is reflective of the vision. We also spoke of the ideal state of mind, which is one with the ideal self-image, which is also reflective of the vision. It's one. And we also mentioned that when we go back into our ideal state of mind, through either imagining in our conversation or any kind of modality that brings us back into our ideal state of mind, we experience a connection one with our vision. Now, this is enormously powerful when it comes to relationships. So let's go a little deeper into this, because he said, sustained attention firmly and repeatedly focus on the object to be accomplished. Now, when we're referring to firmly and repeatedly, we're not speaking of a place of force. We're speaking from a place of faith and conviction. And faith, as Neville stated before, is loyalty to the unseen reality. Now, creation is complete. We learned this in the story of creation. Everything was done. All potential scenarios, circumstances, outcome exist and is revealed in the imagination. This way of looking at reality brings us into further realization of our goals, our visions, our ideal relationship, more from a place of flow. Because much of the resistance of how it works is excluded out of consciousness. Now, sustained attention is automatic when a person is what we refer to as autotelic. Now, many of you know that I refer to a lot the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, in which he talked about deep states of flow and calling it autotelic, one with. It's where we experience time distortion. In a way, you could say perception distortion. And I would also say that it's more about realization. And by realization, we're referring to distinct pathway to the fulfillment. Now let's go back to an experience that I had in my life. When I was around 20 years old, I got promoted into corporate head office. At the time, I was working at the company's distribution center, a warehouse, which through the chain of events later on in my career, I actually got into warehouse management systems and operational stuff related to that, which paved the foundation for my career. So everything contributes to the vision, and the vision contributes to everything else. During that time, I met a mentor. Suddenly showed up in my life. We became friends, and he talked about how, and I brought the story up before, but I'll bring it up again. He mentioned how he actually rose up from starting out in the corporate world from the beginning and then moving up to chief executive officer in a very prominent company. And he shared with me a story, and the story was how one of the individuals that he was dealing with for many years in his career, the later stages in his career, about probably 10 or 15 years, was someone that he always had challenge with. For whatever the reason may be, they could not see eye to eye. And then finally, one day, which was a few years prior to his retirement, he actually felt a change in his consciousness. He had a realization that, and what he had shared with me, which was what he says was his greatest insight in life, which was to bring forth a higher degree of revelation of how people really are simply by converting what we sometimes refer to as the enemy into a friend. So the person, which is an embodiment of our own beliefs, is representative as what we would call an enemy or a person of conflict. And our goal is to identify the meaning that we are associating with the individual and change it to observe how the person becomes our friend. So he did it. He found it in his consciousness, this realization. And the moment he realized that this is the way it was, he noticed that the other person changed. And him and the other person started to actually become friends. And when he retired from his position as chief executive officer, the other individual took his position and further carried the organization forward. And what he shared with me before I got into corporate was, he said, what is the greatest thing that you can do in life? And during that time, I had many different ideas as to what it was, both accurate based on that particular state of mind. But he shared with me his suggestion. He said, the greatest thing you could do in life is to turn an enemy into a friend. Now, this conversation that him and I had started to unravel and continues to unravel all throughout my life. And as I observe that what Neville speaks of is changing the concept of self is the causative factor of converting an enemy into a friend, I realized that this is actually all we were doing along the journey when it comes to building forth ideal relationships. Because we can have within our own mind a lot of interpretations of how we see people to be in relation to personal relationships, business relationships, etc. And one of the goals is to actually practice working with our imagination, so thus bring forth an abundance of imagination, and develop what we call autotelic focus, the ability to see the person as their ideal, as friends with you, and to be able to then experience it as it converts into a friendship. Now, there's a book called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, and he says it really well. He says, leadership is not domination, but the art of persuading people to work toward a common goal. When, in contribution to Neville's conversations and discussions, he speaks of, to the degree that I am self-persuaded, they will become so. So then what we realize is that to the degree that we are self-persuaded, it appears that we are effective persuaders in order to communicate with people in a certain way that facilitates the result. And it may involve some communication, verbally, body language, nonverbal communication, or other means. But the end result is the end result. It's moving towards a common goal. Now, when we look back at what this common goal is referring to, we realize that in our own mind, we have a vision, a goal, how we want our relationships to be in the business world and whatever other kinds of ways that we segment in our mind relationships. But they imply the same thing, a harmonious journey towards a vision. And all throughout the journey of bringing forth our visions, we encounter relationships. And one of the most effective things that we could do, and some of you might know this, I talk about this in my communication program, which, if you're not a student of that, I recommend it, which is No One to Change But Self, which externalizes as effective communication. When we look at this kind of information that he's sharing, leadership, not being in domination, we can really understand what that means. It means not trying to control the external, not trying to fight against circumstances, but rather change the concept of self and how we relate to the others that show up on the journey. And that translates into theater of effective communication towards a common goal. When we say common goal, we can look at it from this perspective, that what you want wants you back. That everybody is in contribution to a vision that you have. We call this finding a purpose or meaning. One of the things that I've noticed in my life when it comes to relationships, personal relationships, business relationships, any kind of relationships, is that when I had a vision, a goal, it automatically seemed that the relationships that would show up in my life would be reflective to that vision. It seems we were relatable in some shape or form. But the moment I made it about the other person, what I noticed was I seemed to distort my way of thinking when it comes to integration. For whatever the reason may be, I put the relationship on a pedestal and then neglected other area of my life. And this played out as theater as an inharmonious relationship. They would find it to be stressful to be around me. Simply put, I was revealing the degree of insecurity. Now, when we go through Neville's conversations, we realize that we take responsibility. We've been talking about this over the last handful of videos, internal locus of control. And from that perspective, we change how we relate to people. So in regards to my story, when I had a vision, or when I have a vision, and now I always make sure I have a vision, a definite chief aim, I realized that all relationships and all people I show up are actually part of that common goal. And they share a vision, they have their own goals, and I am in contribution and in harmony with their goals. I'm able to sit down and actually have these kinds of conversations with them and to be able to identify what their goals are, and they're able to identify it with me. And we actually see how together we play out the relationship towards that end result. What this also does is it removes this neglect of other areas of my life. Because what does that imply? Let's say I was taking a relationship and I was making it all about the relationship, and I was neglecting every other area of my life. In those other areas of my life, I wouldn't be present. I wouldn't find joy in those moments. I wouldn't value those aspects of my life. It is also implying to my subconscious that I do not value myself. And then it plays out in theater in the ways that it can express because it has been impressed on the subconscious via the relationship. So what we want to do is we want to keep our attention on the vision, and we want to relate everything that shows up to be in harmony with your vision and how to make your vision in harmony with everything else. That way you have deep meaning and purpose. And what this does is it brings you into your ideal state of mind. And as we discussed, when you're in your ideal state of mind, we do not have the inner resistance. And when we do not have the inner resistance, we do not have the inner resistance of the ideal relationships, which are reflective of the vision. Then as we go on through the journey, as he had discovered this and shared it with me, and I went through my corporate journey, I must say that I wasn't really integrating it to the extent of how Neville refers to it. But I did start doing it later on in the stages of my IT career in corporate, as well as in my business building days when I was building my IT business after I left corporate. And I continue to do this exact process over and over again as I notice that the relationships transform to reflect the ideal. If we tied what Daniel Goleman said over to what Neville states here, we can see the relatability. So Neville states, "Don't blame, only resolve. Life, like music, can by a new setting turn all its discords into harmonies. Represent your friend to yourself as already expressing that which he desires to be. Let us know that with whatever attitude we approach another, a similar attitude approaches us." So when we're having communications with people, are we seeing them as the enemies, as one of conflict, as one of disharmony? When we're imagining the ideal relationships or the kind of relationships we want in business and personal life, are we also throughout the day, through not maintaining the ideal state of mind or not realizing how this works, going into different imaginal scenes of conflict that represents certain attributes within ourselves that we are externalizing as those attributes in others? He says, how can we do this? Do what my friend did. To establish rapport, call your friend mentally. Focus your attention on him and mentally call his name, just as you would to attract his attention were you to see him on the street. Imagine that he has answered. Mentally hear his voice imagine he is telling you of the great good you have desired for him. You in turn tell him of your joy in witnessing his good fortune. Having mentally heard that which you wanted to hear, having thrilled to the news heard, go about your daily task. Your imagined conversation must awaken what it affirmed. The acceptance of the end wills the means, and the wisest reflection could not devise more effective means than those which are willed by the acceptance of the end. So what we do, and we do this in business, we do this in personal relationships, is as we're interacting with the people, or as we're thinking about them, we're thinking about them as the ideal self that they truly are. And this ideal self is also reflective of your other goals and other areas of your life. It is complementary. And also, it's the assumption that your ideal self is in relation to their goals, their dreams, their aspirations. You're creating a connection of oneness between yourself and the other person. And if, for whatever the reason may be, we were to receive any communication that would symbolize disharmony, we recognize that the disharmony is within ourselves, and we identify what the interpretation is we're giving to the other person, and we change the interpretations within. Now, a lot of these interpretations are buried within the subconscious. And what we can do is we can identify these interpretations on our journey. A person might assume that they're thinking in an accurate way to bring forth and to harmonize ideal relationships. They only need to observe what they're imagining about these relationships that they have with their clients and their vendors and so forth, to be able to reveal what kind of experiences they're going to further create again, and again. And if we identify what those interpretations are, and then upon reflection of those interpretations, find the true interpretations of how it's in harmony and in contribution to your vision, their vision, and concept of self in relation to whatever shows up, then we can do as Neville said, and we can go into our imagination and actually see them in that way. This is the power of the concept in which he refers to as revision, in which at the end of the night you would imagine it playing out in the ideal way. The conversations that you have that didn't appear as harmonious, we find within what the interpretation is. We can find it within ourselves, or we can be inspired by others to help find it within ourselves. And then we conjure up in our mind's eye before going to sleep, in which he refers to as a state akin to sleep, in which the conscious mind is not overthinking to the point of doubting, but rather we are more subconsciously accepting the imaginal scene. And we fall asleep to the assumption, and then we notice that the next day we relate differently to those people, and they relate differently to us. Now, the same is to be said with affirmations, or a self-talk, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done at the end of the day, because all day long we're conjuring up in our mind's eye imaginal scenes and inner conversations that seems to present people in a certain way, either in this regard, an enemy or an ideal relationship or a friend. What we're doing is we are recreating those same experiences again, and again. So he states, however your conversation with your friend must be, in a manner which does not express the slightest doubt as to the truth of what you imagine that you hear and say. If you do not control your imagination, you will find that you are hearing and saying all that you formerly heard and said. We are creatures of habit, and habit, though not law, acts like the most compelling law in the world. With this knowledge of the power of imagination, be as the disciplined man, and transform your world by imagining and feeling only what is lovely and of good rapport. So, going back to the story from one of my earlier mentors and his life experience that he shared with me, which to him was the most profound realization, which was his gift to me, I recognized that this important skill, the identification of where we are assigning this meaning as enemy, not one with the person, and changing that interpretation via imaginal or inner conversations, what will happen is how we relate to them and how they relate to us will change, because all of this is happening within consciousness. And if the idea that the person is an enemy is excluded out of consciousness, then we can only imagine them to be a certain way. And as we continue to imagine them being a certain way, and inner dialogue with them in a certain way, they represent themselves to us in that way. Now, when we look at this and we go back to the beginning, abundance of imagination, all things exist, all potentialities exist. The question is, what are we imagining? What are we imagining about the people in our lives? What are we imagining about the relationships? How are we imagining them to be? Because as we imagine them to be a certain way, they will represent what we imagine them to be. Even if the most persistent proof were to show itself in the outer world of a person being a certain way, in which we would conclude in our mind that they are the enemy, we have the possibility and the ability to change it by changing the inner conversation. And it starts perhaps with a small inner conversation. When I look back then at my corporate journey and when this information really shined, I remember there was a certain individual that during my last years in corporate, for whatever the reason may be, I seemed to always have conflict with this individual. Always seemed to have disputes. We couldn't see eye to eye. It would appear that he would be talking stuff behind my back, and there was always this internal dialogue. And even when I talked to people about this other individual, they would blame it on something else or that person. But for whatever the reason may be, I was not finding that I was the source of this. And during that time, reflecting upon what my mentor had told me, because it showed up, he had revealed to me that potentiality, which was further affirmed by his reference experience. And I assumed it to be true, believed it to be true. I started to notice that I would change how I would see this person, not necessarily in the exact format that Neville speaks with, but more with a format that I learned from Think and Grow Rich, autosuggestion. And what I would notice is this person would communicate to me differently, and I would communicate to this person differently. And actually, I started to get to know the person, and I realized that we were very similar. We had a lot of similarities, and it turns out that those attributes within myself were actually things that he was playing out in theater that I was doing. And we actually ended up becoming friends. And every now and then, we would share conversations when we were in the office, and I felt no disharmony around him. Now, as I go through this journey of life, I notice that upon the reference experience and recognizing and having conversations with others that they've also had these reference experience, that this is really what's going on. The abundance of imagination means all things exist, and all potentialities of how we could see a person exist. And what I refer to as autotelic focus is allowing the subconscious mind to be impressed by the suggestion, which is bypassing the argumentative, let's say, that seems to find all the proof that that person is wrong, to be able to more so each day ascend past it and actually observe the change. Now, this has been so powerful because it has helped me in my entrepreneurial journey. And recently, after working with it to a really high degree, what I'm noticing is that real time in conversations that I'm having with people, that they are revealing the exact ideal self-image that they see themselves to be in the conversation. And their communication to me after that is, it really felt that you believe in me, like you have faith in me, like you see something in me that other people don't necessarily see in me. And what I see in them is that common goal. I recognize that they are in relation to my vision, and their goals, their dreams, their aspirations, what they desire, I can see them as achieving those goals, those dreams, those aspirations. They're on the journey to achieving it. And this is a story we're playing out, the conversation. And they go into that state of mind. Now, the way we can integrate this more so each day is to observe when we're having communications or thinking of certain people, whether it be in relationships, personal, business, whatever kind of interactions with others, and changing how we relate to them in our imagination. And when we do this, what we'll notice is that they will start to change. Perhaps it might be an instant change. Perhaps it might be a gradual change. Because we know that what is full within our consciousness, and we are the interpreters of whatever's within our consciousness, is molding and shaping this reality to its likeness. So let's conclude this with an affirmation then. I realize that all people represent the conception of self. I realize that all people represent the concept of them that I hold within myself. I imagine them how they really want to see themselves. As a result, they imagine me as how I really want to see myself. As a result, I realize that we have a common goal. I realize that we are in a harmonious relationship in relation to this goal. I'm able to recognize it each day as I'm interacting with people harmoniously to the realization of my vision. If you want to copy this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.